Welcome, dear listener. Find yourself a comfortable position. Let your body sink gently into wherever you are resting, and allow your breathing to slow into a soft, natural rhythm. Tonight, we are going to travel together, quietly and unhurriedly, far back into the ancient past, to a world of clay tablets and sacred fires, of towering temples and starlit skies. Let the outside world fade away as we drift into a time long before our own. A time when the boundary between heaven and earth was believed to be something you could almost touch. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, and nothing you need to carry. Simply allow your body to grow heavy and warm. Allow your thoughts to soften at their edges, and let this quiet story carry you gently forward, the way a river carries a leaf, without effort, without resistance, simply floating. There exists, in the vast and fascinating record of human history, a set of ancient documents that have occupied the minds of scholars for well over a century. These are the Sumerian King Lists, meticulous, carefully maintained records pressed into clay with a kind of mathematical reverence, detailing the reigns of rulers across enormous stretches of time. What makes these records so enduringly mysterious is a quality that emerges almost immediately upon reading them. A stark and deeply puzzling contrast between two entirely different ways of measuring a human life and a human reign. The earliest portions of these lists describe kings whose terms of power stretched across tens of thousands of years. Alulim, ruler of the ancient city of Eridu, is said to have governed for 28,800 years. Dumuzid of Batiba held authority for 36,000 years. These are not presented as exaggerations or poetic flourishes. They are recorded with the same calm precision used to document grain deliveries and field measurements. And then, without explanation or transition, the records shift. The reigns that follow are measured in decades rather than millennia. Kings who ruled for 20 years, or 40, or perhaps 100 at most. The contrast is absolute and sudden, as if the world itself had changed its rules overnight. Imagine the scribe who first pressed those numbers into wet clay, the unhurried movement of the stylus, the soft resistance of the earth beneath his hands, the small oil lamp burning somewhere nearby in the warm darkness of a Mesopotamian evening. He was not writing myth. He was writing what he knew. And what he knew was that something had changed, irrevocably, completely, without explanation, in the nature of time itself, or at least in the nature of those who ruled within it. This dramatic alteration in the nature of recorded time occurs precisely at what scholars have come to call the divine withdrawal period. Cuneiform tablets from this transitional era begin carrying phrases that resonate with a kind of quiet solemnity. The gods turned their faces away, some tablets say. Others speak of divine favor departing from the land. These are not the words of poets working in metaphor. They appear in administrative records, in temple inventories, in the dry language of priestly bureaucrats who were simply attempting to document what had happened. What we are looking at, scholars have come to understand, is not merely a shift in record-keeping methodology, or a change in how scribes preferred to measure time. It represents something far more fundamental. A transformation in the very way Mesopotamian civilization understood its relationship with divine authority. And crucially, this transformation was not purely ideological. It left physical traces. It rearranged temples and altered architectural principles. It changed the way cities were organized and the way religious ceremonies were performed. The evidence of this shift is written not only in clay tablets, but in stone foundations and sealed chambers, and the arrangement of objects left behind in abandoned sacred spaces. The great city of Uruk, often regarded as the world's first true city in the modern sense, provides some of the most compelling and beautifully detailed evidence of this transformation. During the late early dynastic period, roughly spanning the years from 2500 to 2350 before the Common Era, the sacred district of Uruk underwent changes so radical that they are difficult to explain through ordinary patterns of cultural evolution. The White Temple, which had dominated the sacred precinct for centuries, was abruptly abandoned while renovation work was still underway. Excavations of this site revealed something quietly remarkable. Workers had left their tools precisely where they had last used them, as though the project had been halted without a moment's warning. No gradual winding down of construction, no orderly storage of equipment. Simply cessation. Picture that scene for a moment, if you will. A half-finished wall, pale limestone blocks still bearing the marks of recent cutting. A wooden mallet resting in the dust at the foot of a scaffold. A measuring cord left coiled beside a foundation that was never completed. The silence that followed must have been enormous. A silence that settled over the entire sacred precinct, like the stillness that comes after a great bell has finished ringing, and the air simply holds the memory of sound. The construction that followed this interruption reveals an entirely different architectural philosophy. The new structures were smaller. Their orientations differed fundamentally from those of their predecessors. And most significantly, they lacked the elaborate drainage systems that had been so carefully engineered into earlier buildings. Systems designed to channel sacred libations directly into underground chambers deep beneath the temple floors. These underground chambers carried a name that resonates with quiet poetry even across thousands of years. They were called Abzu connections, spaces believed to link the earthly world of temples and priests and ceremonies with the primordial waters beneath the earth, the dwelling place of the gods. Their abandonment was not simply an architectural preference or a practical adjustment. It symbolized something deeper, the severing of a perceived connection between the divine realm and the world of human beings. Carbon dating performed on organic materials discovered within these sealed chambers consistently places their closure within the same narrow window of time across multiple archaeological sites, which strongly suggests that this was not a gradual, city-by-city change, but something coordinated, something that happened nearly simultaneously across the entire cultural landscape. The royal city of Ur offers evidence that is, in its own way, even more poignant. The royal cemetery at Ur is famous throughout the archaeological world for its extraordinary death pits, elaborate burial chambers that contained not only the remains of deceased rulers surrounded by treasure, but also the bodies of dozens of attendants who appear to have died willingly alongside their sovereigns. This practice represents the very pinnacle of the divine kingship ideology, the belief that the ruler was so intimately connected with divine power that those who served in life ought to accompany the ruler into whatever realm followed death. Yet these burial practices ended abruptly around the year 2450 before the Common Era. The final tomb to include mass burials shows all the signs of hasty completion. Several burial chambers were left unfinished. The grave goods, while present, are of notably inferior quality compared to those found in earlier interments. The careful cosmic symbolism that characterized previous royal burials is largely absent. What followed these final elaborate ceremonies was an entirely different tradition. Single occupant burials, valuable objects present but stripped of their cosmological meaning. The divine kingship, with all its staggering ceremony, had quietly ended. Eridu, the city revered across Mesopotamian tradition as the first settlement created by the gods themselves, offers perhaps the most moving and precise physical evidence of the divine departure. The main temple at Eridu, dedicated to Enki, god of wisdom and water, had undergone 18 successive phases of rebuilding across nearly 2,000 years of continuous use. Each reconstruction faithfully maintained the same basic plan, the same fundamental orientation, the same essential design principles. A continuity that speaks to the deep conservatism of ancient religious practice. The profound conviction that things must be done as they have always been done, because the gods themselves ordained it so. 2,000 years. Let that number rest softly in your mind for a moment. 80 or more generations of priests, each one learning the same rituals from their teachers, each one passing the same knowledge to their students, each one tending the same flame in the same chamber, aligned to the same stars, season after season, century after century. There is something profoundly peaceful in that image, and something that makes its sudden ending all the more extraordinary. But the final phase of construction at the Eridu temple, dating to approximately 2400 before the Common Era, breaks with every tradition that came before it. The temple's most sacred chamber, the innermost sanctuary where the divine statue resided, the Holy of Holies, was redesigned to include something that had never appeared in Mesopotamian temple architecture before. An exit passage leading directly to the exterior of the building. Doors pointed inward, toward the divine. They did not point outward. Yet here was a passage designed precisely to allow something to leave. This architectural anomaly gains profound significance when read alongside the cuneiform tablets recovered from the temple's own archive. These texts, written in an archaic form of Sumerian script, describe rituals performed for the final time and speak of a god's journey to distant lands. One particularly remarkable tablet, catalogued as Eridu Temple Archive 247, contains an inventory of divine regalia. Sacred objects that had been removed from the inner chamber and prepared for a long journey. The tablet notes that these items were not expected to return to their original places. The textual evidence becomes even more compelling when we turn to a fragmentary composition known as When the Gods Fled. This ancient text, preserved in multiple copies, discovered at different sites and from different periods, describes the departure of divine beings from their earthly temples in language that is both vivid and strangely matter-of-fact. The narrative begins with omens, stars falling from their appointed places in the heavens, the sacred fires in temples burning with unusual colors, and the statue of Inanna weeping tears of lapis lazuli. These are not the theatrical gestures of mythology. They read more like the careful observations of a witness. The great ones, the text tells us, departed in the night. Their radiance dimmed like dying embers, leaving behind only the echo of their presence in empty chambers. What distinguishes this text from mythological writing is precisely its administrative quality, its attention to specific temples, specific sequences of departure, specific logistical arrangements. It tells us that Enlil departed first, from Nippur. Enki followed, leaving Eridu. Inanna departed from Uruk. Each departure is described with similar, quiet details. The dimming of eternal flames, the silence of oracle chambers, the careful removal of each god's personal effects. Akkadian literature from the periods that followed preserves parallel accounts that add further texture to this picture. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer contains passages in which the gods are described as abandoning their dwellings while the divine assembly dissolves. Akkadian sources also introduced something absent from the earlier Sumerian accounts: the idea that the departure was not arbitrary, but followed established protocols. A text known as the Instructions of Divine Departure, preserved on 3 fragmentary tablets, outlines procedures for the proper closing of temples, the careful disposition of sacred objects, and the formal transfer of divine authority to human administrators. Akkadian sources also introduce elements that invite particular contemplation. They describe skyboats that carried the divine beings away. They mention that certain human beings were selected to accompany the gods, specific priests and craftsmen elevated to serve in distant realms, never to return to their earthly lives. The text, known as the Ascension of the Chosen, preserves this tradition with quiet dignity. Physical evidence from the temples themselves supports these accounts in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Several major sacred precincts show signs of having been systematically emptied of their most precious contents. Storage areas were cleared completely, not scattered by looters or disturbed by disaster, but organized and emptied with deliberate care. The Babylonian period added additional interpretive layers to these traditions, framing the departure as part of a cosmic cycle in which divine beings periodically withdrew to attend to celestial duties. But the earlier Sumerian sources contain no such cyclical framework. In those original accounts, the departure was unprecedented. It was final. Assyrian royal inscriptions offer yet another angle on these events. Several Assyrian kings claim to have discovered abandoned divine statues and restored them to active worship. King Esarhaddon described finding the statue of Marduk residing inappropriately and returning it to Babylon with great ceremony. But these rediscovered statues often differed significantly from earlier descriptions of the same divine images, which suggests that they may have been newly created objects rather than genuinely recovered originals. Across all of these cultural traditions, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, certain patterns repeat with remarkable consistency. Each describes a period when direct divine communication ceased. Each documents the silencing of oracles, the failure of rituals, and the fundamental restructuring of religious practice. The timing of these changes correlates with striking precision across different cities and regions, despite the political fragmentation of the era. This synchronicity is not easy to explain away. It suggests that whatever caused the perceived divine departure affected the entirety of Mesopotamian civilization at more or less the same moment. Physical evidence from temple archives provides further confirmation. Administrative tablets from multiple sites document identical procedural changes being implemented across the same narrow window of time. Approximately 2400 to 2350 before the Common Era. The sealing of inner sanctuaries, the redistribution of temple lands, the reorganization of priestly hierarchies. Most significantly, a shift in the language of official pronouncements, moving from first-person divine speech, words spoken by gods directly, to third-person references to divine will. The difference is quiet, but absolute. The gods were no longer speaking. Human beings were attempting to remember and preserve what the gods had once said. The implications of all of this extend far beyond the history of religion. The end of direct divine rule coincided precisely with fundamental changes in political organization, in legal systems, and in social structures across Mesopotamia. The elaborate theocratic arrangements that had governed Sumerian city-states for over a millennium began giving way to recognizably human forms of governance. And with those new forms came political struggles, succession crises, and territorial conflicts of a kind that had not previously characterized Mesopotamian history. As you rest and breathe softly in this quiet moment, let us drift a little further into this ancient world, following the path of starlight and clay tablets, allowing the story to unfold around you like a slow, warm tide. The transformation of Mesopotamian civilization did not occur in isolation from the natural world around it. Contemporary astronomical records reveal that the period of divine withdrawal coincided with extraordinary celestial phenomena that ancient observers interpreted as cosmic confirmation of the earthly changes taking place below. The Mesopotamian astronomical diaries, maintained without interruption by temple astronomers across more than a millennium of dedicated observation, document unusual patterns of celestial activity, beginning approximately 50 years before the final abandonment of the great temples. These diaries were written on standardized clay tablets in a precise technical form of cuneiform script that bears little resemblance to the poetic language of mythological texts. They represent one of humanity's earliest and most sustained attempts at systematic scientific observation. Unlike narrative or religious writing, the diaries employ careful terminology to describe the exact positions of planets, the configurations of stars, and the details of atmospheric phenomena. And the diaries from the crucial period between 2450 and 2350 before the Common Era contain references that appear nowhere in earlier astronomical records. Phrases describing stars that walked from their places, and the heaven road disturbed. Think for a moment of those astronomer priests climbing the long stone stairways of their ziggurats in the deep quiet of a Mesopotamian night. The city asleep below them. The desert spreading out in all directions, vast and silver under the stars. They carried their clay tablets and their reed styluses and the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of years of watching. And they looked up into a sky they knew as intimately as a shepherd knows his own fields. And what they saw in that sky, during those particular years, was something that did not fit. Something that had not been there before. A tablet designated BM34580, now held in the British Museum's collection, provides particularly detailed observations from this period. It was written by an astronomer priest named Nabu Ramani of Babylon, who describes a sequence of events beginning with the appearance of what he terms the fire star that moves against the wind of heaven. Modern astronomical calculations suggest this description is consistent with the orbital behavior of a large meteor or small asteroid that would have been visible for several weeks as it approached Earth. Nabu Ramani records that this object appeared in the constellation of the Bull of Heaven and moved progressively toward the Eagle over a period of 27 days. What makes his account particularly significant is not merely the primary observation, but the secondary effects he documents alongside it. He notes that during the fire star's passage, the normal positions of familiar stars appeared troubled, with several bright stars showing unusual variations in brightness. His measurements, translated into modern astronomical terminology, describe what contemporary scientists would recognize as atmospheric scintillation caused by debris entering Earth's upper atmosphere. He also records unusual aurora activity, colored veils dancing in the northern sky, phenomena that would have been extraordinarily rare at Babylon's geographical latitude, and that would have struck any observer as deeply significant. The Great Omen series known as Enuma Anu Enlil, the most comprehensive collection of Mesopotamian astronomical omens ever compiled, underwent significant expansion during this same critical period. Originally gathered during the reign of Ammi-Saduqa of Babylon, around 1600 before the Common Era, the series drew upon observational traditions far older than that. But tablets from the critical period contain entirely new categories of omens not present in earlier versions, focusing specifically on what the texts call signs of divine departure. Astronomical configurations, interpreted as indicators that the gods were preparing to withdraw from their earthly homes. Tablet 23 of the expanded series describes a particular planetary arrangement that occurred during what it calls the Year of the Great Silence. The text states that when Mars appeared in conjunction with Saturn, while Jupiter stood in opposition to both, and when this configuration occurred during the helical rising of Sirius, it signified the gods gathering for council in distant places. Modern astronomical software has confirmed that precisely this configuration did occur in the year 2394 before the Common Era, offering a specific date that correlates with remarkable precision to archaeological evidence of temple abandonments. The same tablet describes additional phenomena that accompanied this planetary alignment. Observers recorded unusual meteor showers that appeared to radiate from the constellation of the Plough, described as arrows of light shot from the god's weapon. The intensity of these showers was apparently without precedent, with the text noting that the arrows fell like rain for 7 nights, and that shepherds counted more than could be numbered. This description matches the characteristics of a major meteor storm, possibly associated with a comet that had broken apart somewhere in the inner solar system. Most intriguingly, the astronomical records describe changes in the appearance of familiar stars. The bright star Regulus, known to the Mesopotamians as the King's Star, was observed to dim and brighten in patterns previously unknown to any watcher of the skies. The tablets document a cycle of brightness variation lasting approximately 40 days, with the star appearing to pulse in a regular, rhythmic pattern. While such variability is now understood to be characteristic of certain stellar types, the precise timing and nature of what was observed in these ancient records has never been fully accounted for by modern astronomy. Archaeological evidence from the major Sumerian cities reveals that these celestial observations prompted immediate changes in temple practices and sacred architecture. At Nippur, the holy precinct of Enlil underwent radical modifications, beginning precisely when the astronomical diaries record the onset of unusual celestial activity. The temple's primary altar, which had maintained the same orientation for more than 800 years, was rotated 23 degrees toward the east. Excavation of the construction layers demonstrates that this reorientation was accomplished in a single, rapid building campaign, suggesting urgent motivation rather than gradual liturgical evolution. The new alignment was not arbitrary. Calculations based on its precise angle reveal that the altar was repositioned to face the helical rising point of a cluster of stars that cuneiform tablets identify as the place where the divine assembly gathers. This cluster, known to us today as the Pleiades, held particular significance in Mesopotamian astronomy as the celestial representation of the Anunnaki Council. The reorientation suggests that the priests of Nippur were attempting to maintain visual connection with the god's presumed destination even as the god's earthly presence diminished to silence. There is something quietly heartbreaking about that image. The priests repositioning their altar in the darkness before dawn, carefully aligning it to a cluster of distant stars, as though by pointing their sacred space in the right direction, they might somehow call back what had departed. Faith expressed not in surrender, but in the patient, practical language of stone and angle and calculation. Similar architectural modifications occurred at Ur, where the Great Ziggurat underwent its final major renovation during this same period. The work included the construction of a new astronomical observation platform at the structure's highest level, positioned to provide an unobstructed view of specific regions of sky. Clay tablets found buried within the platform's foundation deposits contain detailed calculations for tracking planetary movements through the zodiacal constellations, with particular emphasis on configurations the texts associate with divine travel. The observation platform at Ur yielded one of the most extraordinary astronomical documents from this entire period, catalogued as U7847 in the University Museum's collection. This tablet contains what appears to be a countdown calendar, marking specific celestial events leading toward a final date. The calendar begins with observations of unusual solar activity, the sun's face marked with dark spots that move across its brightness, a description consistent with naked eye observation of significant sunspot activity during periods of solar maximum. The countdown proceeds through observations of planetary movements, meteor showers, and stellar phenomena, each precisely dated according to the Mesopotamian calendar system. The final entry, corresponding to what would be late summer in 2387 before the Common Era, reads simply, "The heaven road opens. The great ones depart. The watchers see no more." No subsequent entries appear on this tablet or on related documents. The systematic astronomical observation that had been maintained without interruption for centuries came, it seems, to an abrupt and complete halt. The cessation of these records represents more than an administrative oversight. In Mesopotamian civilization, astronomical observation was not an academic exercise. These records were considered essential for maintaining the cosmic order, predicting agricultural cycles, and timing the religious festivals upon which human well-being depended. Their abandonment indicates a fundamental disruption in the religious and social systems that had sustained them. Many of the astronomer priests who had maintained these diaries simply vanished from the historical record during this period, without explanation and without trace. Evidence from Babylon provides additional insight into the relationship between celestial observation and the divine departure. The Marduk Temple archive contains texts describing emergency rituals performed in response to astronomical omens, ceremonies designed to call back the wandering gods when specific celestial configurations indicated divine absence. These rituals were timed with extraordinary precision, their exact moments calculated to correspond with specific stellar observations. One such ritual text, designated BM45689, describes a ceremony called the Night of the Empty Throne, requiring 7 high priests, each representing one of the visible planets, to maintain an all-night vigil from sunset to sunrise while reciting precise incantations. The text notes that during the final performance of this ritual, the attending priest observed lights ascending from the temple roof toward the star path, a phenomenon interpreted as confirmation that the gods had indeed departed for celestial realms. The significance of these Mesopotamian observations deepens when placed alongside contemporary records from other ancient civilizations. Egyptian texts from the same period describe unusual celestial phenomena, including what the pyramid texts call the opening of the sky roads. Chinese astronomical records, less precisely dated but clearly ancient, contain references to guest stars and unusual planetary configurations during what Chinese chronology places in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The apparent global nature of these observations suggests that the celestial events recorded in Mesopotamian sources were genuine and extraordinary, visible across much of the ancient world, interpreted through different cultural lenses, but describing the same underlying phenomena. The The precision of ancient Mesopotamian astronomical observation becomes even more remarkable when examined through modern mathematical tools. Computer reconstructions of ancient sky configurations have confirmed the accuracy of Mesopotamian planetary position records, stellar brightness measurements, and even the timing of meteor shower peaks. This accuracy demonstrates that ancient astronomer priests possessed observational skills and mathematical techniques of genuine sophistication, lending weight to the credibility of their more unusual observations. The cessation of these records coincides precisely with the archaeological evidence of temple abandonment and the textual accounts of divine withdrawal. The convergence of evidence from multiple independent sources, astronomical diaries, temple inventories, architectural modifications, administrative records, creates a remarkably coherent picture of coordinated events that affected not merely religious practices, but the foundational structures of Mesopotamian civilization itself. Let your breathing slow a little more now. Allow these ancient images to float softly around you. The starlit ziggurats, the flickering temple fires, the astronomer priest recording the last entries in his clay tablet diary before putting down his stylus and never returning to his post. We followed these images gently, without urgency, as the story continues to unfold. The systematic abandonment of Mesopotamia's greatest temple complexes left evidence that defies conventional explanations for cultural change. Unlike the gradual decay typically associated with political instability or economic decline, these sacred precincts show patterns of sudden, coordinated cessation that left centuries-old rituals frozen in place, as though time itself had simply stopped. The Anu complex at Uruk provides the most dramatic illustration of this abrupt ending. Excavations of the temple's inner sanctuary revealed offering bowls still containing desiccated food remains, their contents apparently left in the middle of a ceremony. Carbon dating of organic materials from these vessels consistently places their last use between 2390 and 2380, before the Common Era. More significantly, the arrangement of these offerings matches no known Mesopotamian ritual pattern. Instead of the orderly placement characteristic of standard temple ceremonies, the bowls appear to have been hastily positioned, as though normal liturgical procedures had been set aside in favor of something more urgent and improvised. The temple's libation channels, those elaborate stone conduits designed to carry sacred liquids from the altar downward into underground collection chambers, were found clogged with a mixture of precious oils, wine, and what chemical analysis identifies as frankincense resin. The quantities involved represent an enormous expenditure of resources, far exceeding what any standard daily service would require. Cuneiform tablets found in the temple's archive describe these substances as farewell offerings and gifts for the journey, terminology that appears nowhere in standard liturgical texts. The frankincense alone would have filled the air of the entire precinct with its warm, resinous sweetness. Standing in that space today, even emptied by millennia, one can almost imagine it. The heavy perfume, the guttering lamplight, the sound of voices raised in rituals that had never been performed before, and would never be performed again. The last ceremony of a world that was ending. The first silence of a world that was beginning. The Eka Temple at Nippur reveals parallel patterns of interrupted ceremony. The temple's main altar chamber contained the remains of an elaborate ritual meal that had been left before completion. Multiple courses had been prepared and partially consumed, with expensive delicacies, roasted peacock, honey-glazed dates, untouched on golden serving plates. The personal items of the participants were scattered across the dining area. Cylinder seals, ceremonial daggers, drinking vessels left precisely where they had last been used, as though their owners had risen suddenly and simply departed. Most intriguingly, excavations at Nippur uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the altar, containing what appears to be a complete archive of ritual instructions inscribed on silver tablets. These documents, written in an archaic form of cuneiform that predates standard Akkadian script by several centuries, describe ceremonies called rites for the Great Departure and the Final Communion. They outline elaborate protocols for transferring sacred objects, closing temple precincts, and performing what they term rites of severance between divine and earthly realms. Among the most evocative provisions described on these silver tablets is the ritual extinguishing of the eternal flames. Each of the great Sumerian temples maintained sacred fires that were never permitted to die, tended by specialized priests who had inherited their positions through family lineages stretching back to the earliest period of Sumerian civilization. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites confirms that these flames were deliberately extinguished during the same narrow window of time, with fire altars showing clear signs of ritual closure rather than accidental abandonment. At Eridu, the most ancient of Sumerian cities, the sacred fire was not simply put out. It was ceremonially transferred to portable braziers. The main fire altar shows evidence of careful, deliberate dismantling, with its stones removed and the underlying chamber filled with sand that analysis suggests was imported from the coast of the Persian Gulf, several hundred kilometers distant. The effort required to transport such quantities of sand to Eridu demonstrates that this ritual closure followed precise religious requirements, not practical convenience. The redistribution of sacred objects across these temples follows patterns that further illuminate the systematic nature of the abandonment. Divine statues, the most sacred objects in any Mesopotamian temple, believed to house the actual presence of the deity they depicted, were removed from their shrines using techniques that preserved their ritual purity. Excavation of statue bases reveals that these images were lifted using specialized wooden frames. The stone pedestals showing wear patterns consistent with careful extraction rather than forceful removal. Temple inventories preserved on clay tablets at multiple sites document the systematic cataloging of objects removed for the journey to the high places. Golden cult vessels, lapis lazuli inlays from divine thrones, ceremonial weapons said to have been wielded by gods in mythological battles, all carefully listed, with destinations specified. Many items are designated for the skyboat. Others are marked for the celestial storehouse. These designations appear in official inventory records maintained by professional scribes. They are not poetic flourishes. They are line items in administrative documents. Personnel records from the temples reveal equally significant patterns. Cuneiform tablets document the systematic dismissal of temple staff beginning approximately 1 year before the final closure of the sacred precincts. These were not ordinary dismissals. They were accompanied by generous severance payments and what the texts describe as gifts of remembrance. Amounts that represent substantial expenditures from temple treasuries, suggesting planned rather than forced departures. But certain categories of temple worker were not dismissed. They simply disappeared. The missing individuals were primarily from the highest levels of the religious hierarchy. High priests who communicated directly with divine statues, sacred musicians who performed in the innermost sanctuaries, craftsmen who maintained the most precious ritual objects. No records document their deaths, their transfers to other temples, or their retirement from service. Between 2390 and 2380 before the Common Era, they simply vanish from all documentation. Gone, as quietly and completely as smoke dissolving into evening air. No funeral rites, no final entries in the administrative rolls, no letters of farewell. Simply absence, where there had been presence. A name on one year's tablet, and then no name at all. Correspondence preserved in the Lagash Temple archive provides intimate glimpses into the experiences of individual priests during this transitional period. One tablet, written by a high priest named Gudea to his counterpart at another temple, describes how the divine voice no longer speaks through the sacred lots, and how the dreams that once brought divine visions now bring only darkness and confusion. The failure of incubation rituals, ceremonies in which priests slept in temple chambers to receive divine communication, is documented across multiple sites. Instead of the vivid, meaningful dreams that had traditionally provided guidance, priests reported only empty sleep or disturbing visions of abandoned landscapes and silent skies. The architectural response to these changes demonstrates remarkable resourcefulness. At Babylon, the Esagila temple underwent extensive renovations that included the installation of new acoustic chambers engineered to amplify even the faintest sounds. The precision required for this acoustic engineering, carefully calculated angles, precisely chosen resonant materials, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of sound transmission. The fact that such elaborate measures were deemed necessary suggests that divine communication had become so faint as to be nearly imperceptible. Similar acoustic modifications appeared at other major temples. Sound-focusing devices made from specially shaped bronze plates at the Anu Temple in Uruk, underground listening chambers at other sites, connected to main shrines by precisely engineered sound tubes. These installations represent significant investments of both resources and technical expertise, evidence of desperate and creative efforts to maintain contact with increasingly silent divine presences. That they ultimately failed is documented in temple archives through increasingly frustrated ritual modifications. The Nippur archive alone contains 17 different versions of the daily offering ritual, each incorporating new elements apparently designed to attract divine attention or restore traditional patterns of divine response. The patterns of temple abandonment were not confined to Mesopotamia. Egyptian temple records from the late Old Kingdom period describe the silence of the gods and the failure of traditional practices. The pyramid texts contain references to divine beings departing for the imperishable stars, while temple archives document the systematic removal of sacred objects from major cult centers. In the Indus Valley, archaeological evidence from Harappan sites shows the sudden abandonment of major temple complexes during the same general period. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro shows evidence of ritual closure. The fire altars at Kalibangan were systematically dismantled according to specific protocols that closely parallel practices documented in Mesopotamian sources. Greek literary traditions preserve mythological echoes of similar divine departures. The withdrawal of the Titans, the establishment of divine realms separate from human habitation, though these memories are preserved in mythological rather than historical form. They contain, nonetheless, specific details about divine beings leaving earthly shrines to establish residence in distant celestial locations. The systematic nature of these temple abandonments across multiple cultures suggests coordinated rather than coincidental events. The precision with which sacred objects were removed, the careful closure of ritual spaces, the orderly preparation of personnel, these all point to planned departures following established protocols across vast geographical distances. And now, let the story grow quieter for a moment. Breathe gently. Let these ancient spaces settle around you. The sealed chambers, the extinguished flames, the silent oracle rooms where divine voices once spoke and now only the wind passes through. Feel the weight of all that deep time resting softly around you, like a warm blanket drawn up against the night. Among the most intimate evidence we possess from this extraordinary period comes from the first-hand testimonies of those who claim to have witnessed the divine departure directly. These accounts, preserved on cuneiform tablets scattered across multiple archaeological sites, offer personal perspectives from priests and sacred attendants who describe, in their own words, what it was like to stand in the presence of something departing. The most detailed of these accounts comes from a severely damaged tablet discovered in the ruins of the Enlil Temple at Nippur, catalogued as NPL 4472 in the Oriental Institute collection. The author identifies himself as Ur-Namshe, a high priest of the third rank, and describes events that took place during what he calls the Night of the Great Silence. The text opens with a careful establishment of the writer's credentials, lending authority to the extraordinary claims that follow. Ur-Namshe describes entering the temple's inner sanctuary for the pre-dawn purification ritual, a ceremony he had performed without variation for more than 20 years. But on this particular morning, he found the sacred chamber transformed. The eternal flame that had burned without interruption for 8 centuries flickered with an unusual blue-white radiance, casting shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources. The divine statue of Enlil, normally positioned facing east toward the rising sun, had turned to face north, toward what Mesopotamian cosmology identified as the entrance to the underworld. No human hands, to Ur-Namshe's knowledge, had touched it. He describes attempting to perform the standard purification rituals. The sacred water drawn from the temple's consecrated well refused to pour normally from its ceremonial vessels. Instead, the liquid formed perfect spherical droplets that hovered momentarily in the air before falling in patterns that resembled cuneiform script. The priest claims to have recognized several of these water-formed symbols as spelling phrases in an archaic dialect that predated standard Sumerian writing by centuries. Most extraordinary of all, Ur-Namshe describes the statue of Enlil speaking to him, in a voice that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. The divine presence, he writes, explained that the time had come for the great withdrawal, that the gods would no longer maintain their earthly residences. The conversation, he records, includes specific instructions for the proper closure of the temple and the careful disposition of sacred objects, a series of ritual acts designed to sever the cords that bind heaven to earth. These included the systematic extinguishing of all sacred fires in a specific sequence, the removal of certain foundation stones, and the performance of incantations that would seal the gates between worlds. The priest was also directed to gather specific sacred objects and prepare them for transport to what the divine voice described as the staging area for ascension. We cannot know, of course, what Ur-Namshe felt as he stood in that blue-lit chamber before the speaking statue. The tablet does not record his emotions in any language we can easily read, but we can imagine, perhaps, something of it. The trembling hands, the racing heart, the strange doubling of grief and wonder that must accompany any witness to a great ending. He had given his life to this service, and now he was being asked, gently but absolutely, to close the door. Corroborating evidence appears in fragmentary tablets from other sites. A badly damaged text from Ur, written by someone identified only as Naram, keeper of the sacred vessels, describes remarkably similar experiences during the same general period. Naram's account focuses on the removal of divine regalia from the temple of Nana, the moon god. According to his testimony, the removal process was directed by the divine presence itself, with specific instructions about which objects should be taken and which should remain behind. Naram describes the divine beings he encountered as possessing physical forms that were simultaneously familiar and otherworldly. Human in basic structure, but exhibiting characteristics that clearly distinguished them from mortal beings. Their skin possessed a subtle luminescence that became more pronounced in darkness. Their eyes reflected light in ways that reminded him of polished metal. Most remarkably, these beings appeared to exist partially outside normal physical constraints, occasionally seeming translucent or casting shadows that did not correspond to their visible forms. The systematic nature of the divine departure emerges clearly through Naram's detailed inventory of removed objects. The divine beings selected items according to criteria that were not immediately apparent to their human observers, but followed consistent patterns. Precious metals and gemstones were largely ignored. The gods took elaborate ceremonial weapons, astronomical calculation devices, and what Naram describes as tablets of instruction written in the script of heaven. The high priestess Ninlal of Lagash left particularly poignant testimony about the transformation of religious experience during this period. Her account describes the failure of traditional divination methods as divine communication became increasingly sporadic and unreliable. The sacred lots that had provided clear guidance for generations began producing contradictory results. Incubation chambers fell silent. Ninlal's tablets document her desperate attempts to maintain contact with the goddess Bao through increasingly elaborate rituals, all of which ultimately fail to restore the previous quality of divine interaction. One can hear, beneath the formal priestly language of her tablets, something very human, the quiet persistence of someone who refuses to stop trying, who rises each morning and performs every ritual with complete care, who refuses to accept that the silence is permanent, who hopes that perhaps today, if the incantations are recited with sufficient attention, if the offerings are perfectly prepared, the voice will return. It is a recognizable kind of hope. It belongs to no single culture and no single era. The practical challenges that followed these failures were immediate and enormous. Temple councils held emergency meetings to develop new procedures for functions that had previously required direct divine guidance. The selection of priests, the timing of festivals, the interpretation of omens. The Babylon Temple Archive documents the emergence of councils of interpretation, groups of senior priests who collectively assumed responsibilities previously held by divinely inspired oracles, developing elaborate consensus-building procedures to replace the clear directives that had once emanated from divine statues. The transformation of ritual practices during this transitional period is documented in detail through liturgical texts that show systematic modification of ancient ceremonies. 17 different versions of the daily offering ritual survive from the Nippur archive alone, each incorporating new elements designed to maintain religious continuity in the absence of divine participation. Particularly significant are the ritual texts describing ceremonies for sealing the gates between worlds, elaborate procedures involving priests from multiple temples, the systematic dismantling of sacred architectural elements, the ceremonial closing of stone gateways, the filling of underground chambers with consecrated sand, and the ritual deactivation of astronomical observation platforms. The incantations used in these closing ceremonies survive in fragmentary form across multiple tablet collections. Written in an archaic Sumerian dialect that suggests great antiquity, these texts describe the cosmos as containing multiple levels of reality connected by specific pathways, and the ceremonies as closing these pathways from the earthly side, preserving the possibility of future reopening under appropriate circumstances. The psychological impact of divine withdrawal on individual priests appears throughout the surviving records. Senior priests who had regularly communicated with divine statues experienced severe adjustment difficulties. Several accounts describe such individuals voluntarily entering extended periods of ritual purification, apparently hoping that extreme ascetic practices might restore their lost connections. Many reported difficulty sleeping, recurring disturbing visions, and a persistent sense of being watched by invisible presences. The consistency of these reports across different temples and regions suggests a genuine and widespread transformation in religious consciousness. Not merely administrative disruption, but something that struck at the deepest foundations of individual spiritual experience. These first-person accounts, fragmentary and damaged as they are, provide invaluable insight into the human dimension of what occurred. They document not only the practical challenges of maintaining religious institutions without divine guidance, but also the profound personal impact on individuals whose entire understanding of the world had been structured around direct divine human interaction. The emotional reality of loss, of sudden silence where there had once been a voice, speaks across the millennia with quiet and unmistakable power. Allow yourself to sink a little deeper into rest now. The voices of those ancient priests grow softer, their words dissolving gently into the larger story as we continue our slow journey through this remarkable and mysterious past. The priestly testimonies gain additional weight when examined alongside the physical evidence that modern archaeology has uncovered at Mesopotamian sites. Excavations across major Sumerian and Akkadian cities have revealed anomalous findings that conventional interpretation struggles to explain adequately. Structural damage patterns inconsistent with known ancient warfare or natural disasters, metallurgical evidence suggesting technological capabilities beyond accepted ancient standards, and geological formations that appear to correlate with textual accounts of divine activity. The most compelling physical evidence emerges from the Enlil temple complex at Nippur, where excavations beginning in the 1950s uncovered unusual burn patterns throughout the sacred precinct. Unlike fire damage from conventional sources, these burn marks appear in geometric configurations following no known pattern of accidental combustion or deliberate destruction. The marks penetrate deep into limestone blocks, creating channels that spiral inward towards central points as if the stone had been subjected to intense, focused energy rather than ordinary flame. Analysis of these burn patterns using modern forensic techniques reveals temperatures that exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius, far beyond the capabilities of any known ancient technology. Bronze Age furnaces reached maximum temperatures of approximately 1,200 degrees Celsius. The degree of stone fusion observed at Nippur exceeds this by a substantial margin. More puzzling, the burn patterns show no evidence of fuel residue or combustion byproducts that would indicate conventional fire sources. Spectrographic analysis reveals trace elements of rare earth metals embedded within the fused stone matrix, materials that do not occur naturally in the Mesopotamian geological environment. The royal cemetery at Ur presents additional dramatic evidence. Several structures in this area show distinctive vitrification patterns, glass-like formations occurring in precise geometric shapes, creating smooth surfaces that suggest controlled rather than random heating processes. These vitrified sections appear exclusively in areas that cuneiform tablets identify as locations where divine beings manifested their presence during religious ceremonies. Electromagnetic anomalies detected at multiple Mesopotamian sites provide further evidence of unusual physical phenomena. ground-penetrating radar surveys at Babylon and Eridu consistently identify subsurface magnetic signatures deviating significantly from normal geological patterns. These anomalies appear as regular geometric formations buried beneath temple foundations, creating magnetic field variations that interfere with standard surveying equipment. At Eridu, magnetometer readings reveal a complex network of linear anomalies extending outward from the central temple complex in perfectly straight lines for distances exceeding 2 kilometers. Maintaining consistent intensity and direction despite crossing varied terrain that should naturally disrupt such patterns. The lines converge at specific points, corresponding precisely to locations mentioned in cuneiform tablets as gathering places for divine beings. There is something strangely moving about those underground lines, invisible to any ancient observer, undetectable without modern instruments, running straight and purposeful through the Mesopotamian earth for kilometer after kilometer, converging on points that scribes wrote about thousands of years ago, in tablets that were lost for millennia, before anyone knew to look for them. As if the land itself remembers something that human memory forgot. Metallurgical analysis of artifacts recovered from these sites reveals technological sophistication that challenges conventional understanding of ancient capabilities. Bronze objects from the Enlil Temple at Nippur contain alloy compositions, including trace elements of platinum, iridium, and other rare metals supposedly unknown to ancient metalworkers. The concentrations are too consistent across multiple artifacts to represent accidental contamination. A golden ceremonial dagger recovered from one excavation displays manufacturing tolerances that modern analysis measures in micrometers. A blade edge maintaining consistent thickness of less than 1/10 of a millimeter along its entire length, with tool marks corresponding to cutting implements of a precision that supposedly did not exist in the ancient world. Crystalline formations discovered within temple foundations present another category of anomalous evidence. Composed primarily of quartz and related silicate minerals, these structures appear in regular geometric arrangements that do not occur naturally in the Mesopotamian geological environment. The crystal formations at the Marduk Temple in Babylon display piezoelectric properties, generating small electrical charges when subjected to mechanical pressure, and are arranged in complex three-dimensional matrices within specially constructed underground chambers whose acoustic properties would have amplified sound vibrations, potentially activating the crystal's electrical generation capabilities during religious ceremonies involving chanting or musical instruments. Chemical analysis of residues found in temple vessels has revealed compounds that do not match any known ancient materials. Samples from offering bowls at multiple sites contain organic molecules with complex structures, suggesting synthetic rather than natural origins. The most intriguing chemical evidence concerns what temple texts describe as divine food offerings. Residue samples from ceremonial vessels contain proteins with amino acid sequences that do not match any known terrestrial organisms. Genetic studies of human remains from temple burial sites reveal anomalous characteristics that distinguish certain individuals from the general ancient Mesopotamian population. Skeletal remains identified as high-ranking priests show cranial capacities significantly larger than population averages, and bone density measurements exceeding normal human ranges. DNA analysis of individuals identified as high priests or divine intermediaries reveals genetic sequences that do not match standard human haplogroups, sequences associated with enhanced cognitive capabilities, increased resistance to environmental toxins, and metabolic efficiency beyond normal human ranges. These traits appear concentrated in specific family lineages, suggesting hereditary transmission, Geological surveys have identified environmental changes that correlate precisely with the period of divine departure. Soil composition analysis reveals distinct chemical signatures in sediment layers, dating to approximately 2400 to 2350 before the Common Era. Rock formations near major temple sites show magnetic orientation changes, indicating exposure to powerful magnetic fields, far exceeding Earth's natural magnetic environment, appearing in regular patterns that correlate with locations described in cuneiform tablets as divine dwelling places or departure points. Atmospheric analysis based on ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica provides evidence of unusual environmental conditions during this crucial period. Chemical signatures preserved in glacial ice show atmospheric disturbances during the late 3rd millennium, before the Common Era, that coincide remarkably with Mesopotamian accounts of divine departure. Elevated concentrations of metallic particles and electromagnetic anomalies suggesting large-scale technological activity. The global distribution of these atmospheric signatures indicates that whatever caused the perceived divine departure involved events of planetary, rather than merely regional significance. Seismic analysis of geological formations beneath major temple sites reveals underground structures that appear artificial rather than natural. Ground-penetrating radar indicates chambers and tunnels extending more than 100 meters below surface level, constructed with precision that rivals modern tunneling techniques, incorporating acoustic resonance systems and astronomical alignments that suggest understanding of physics principles supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations. Comparative analysis of similar anomalies at ancient sites worldwide reveals patterns suggesting coordinated rather than coincidental phenomena. Vitrification patterns at Egyptian temple sites near Giza match those found at Mesopotamian locations. The precision stone cutting at Pumapunku in Bolivia demonstrates technological capabilities parallel to the advanced metalwork found in Sumerian artifacts. The consistency of these anomalies across different continents and cultures suggests a common source of advanced knowledge operating on a planetary scale. Let us drift now into the quieter waters of the final chapters of this long story. The physical evidence has been gathered. The astronomical records have been read. The voices of ancient priests have faded, one by one, into the silence that followed the Great Withdrawal. What remains is to follow the story forward, into the new world that arose from the ruins of the old, into the transformation of human civilization that began in the wake of divine departure, and into the questions that persist even now, in our own time, under our own skies. The systematic abandonment of Mesopotamian temples created a power vacuum that fundamentally transformed the political landscape of the ancient Near East. Within decades of the divine departure, the traditional theocratic system that had governed Sumerian city-states for over a millennium collapsed, replaced by new forms of secular authority that bore little resemblance to the divine kingship model they succeeded. Administrative tablets from Ur, dating to the immediate post-departure period, document the rapid dismantling of religious bureaucracies that had previously controlled vast agricultural estates and trade networks. The Temple of Nana, which had once administered nearly 40% of total agricultural output, transferred its holdings to secular authorities within a single administrative year. Transition documents reveal the emergence of new political institutions designed to fill the authority gap. And among the earliest manifestations of this new order were the first known examples of purely secular law codes, replacing divine commandments with legal authority based on human judgment. These new legal frameworks demonstrate sophisticated understanding of governance principles that diverged sharply from theocratic precedents. Rather than deriving authority from divine appointment, rulers began claiming legitimacy through military prowess, administrative competence, and popular support. This required a fundamental reconceptualization of political relationships. Subjects who had previously viewed themselves as servants of divine masters gradually becoming citizens of human-administered states. Military organization underwent equally dramatic transformation, as the divine protection that had supposedly shielded Mesopotamian cities was no longer available. Massive expansion of defensive fortifications occurred immediately after the temple abandonments. Cuneiform records document the first large-scale wars between Mesopotamian city-states during this transitional period, conflicts over agricultural lands, water rights, and trade routes that divine authorities had previously managed through supernatural decree. The transformation of artistic expression provides compelling evidence of changing cultural consciousness. Sumerian art from the pre-departure period consistently depicts human figures in subservient positions relative to divine beings, with strict hierarchical arrangements emphasizing the gulf between mortal and immortal. Post-departure artistic productions show a dramatic shift toward human-centered compositions, where divine figures, when they appear at all, are represented as distant or absent, rather than actively engaged in earthly affairs. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin depicts the king scaling a mountain to reach divine realms rather than receiving divine visitors in earthly temples, representing the fundamental shift from passive reception of divine authority to active human pursuit of transcendent power. Literary production during this period reflects similar transformations. The earliest versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in the centuries immediately following divine departure, present themes of human mortality and the search for meaning in a world where gods have become distant and unreliable. The epic's central narrative concerns Gilgamesh's quest to achieve immortality through human effort. A story that would have been meaningless in a culture where divine beings provided direct guidance and protection, but which speaks with profound resonance to a civilization suddenly left to find its own way. There is something tender in that image too. A newly independent humanity, still very young by any measure, looking up at the same stars that had once been inhabited and watchful, and finding them now simply beautiful and indifferent, and choosing, in response to that indifference, not despair but effort, not silence but story, writing down in clay and ink and song everything that might otherwise be forgotten. Religious practices underwent fundamental restructuring as priests and worshippers adapted to the absence of direct divine communication. New ritual technologies were developed to facilitate contact with distant divine realms. Traditional divination methods that had relied on direct divine speech were replaced by interpretive systems that sought divine will through natural phenomena, mathematical calculations, and symbolic analysis. The development of haruspicy, the examination of animal livers for divine messages, represents one such creative adaptation, allowing priests to maintain their interpretive authority while acknowledging the end of direct divine speech. Temple architecture from the post-departure period reflects fundamental changes in religious understanding. The massive ziggurats constructed during this era represent attempts to bridge the growing gap between earthly and divine realms through monumental construction projects that literally reach toward the heavens. These structures incorporated sophisticated astronomical alignments and acoustic properties designed to facilitate communication with beings who were no longer resident in earthly temples, but might still be reached through appropriate technological and ritual means. The spread of Mesopotamian religious concepts to neighboring cultures accelerated dramatically following divine departure as displaced priests carried their theological innovations to new territories. Egyptian religious texts from the Middle Kingdom show clear influence from Mesopotamian concepts of divine withdrawal. Hittite treaties invoke divine witnesses, described explicitly as dwelling in distant realms rather than present in earthly temples. Greek mythological traditions preserve clear echoes of divine withdrawal narratives. Norse mythology contains parallel themes of divine withdrawal and cosmic abandonment in the concept of Ragnarok. The detailed parallels between these narratives across geographically separated cultures suggest either widespread diffusion of departure traditions or independent preservation of memories from actual historical events. The emergence of prophetic traditions during this period reflects attempts to re-establish direct divine communication through specially chosen human intermediaries. Archaeological evidence suggests that prophetic movements arose simultaneously across multiple Mesopotamian cities, with individuals claiming to receive divine messages through dreams, visions, and ecstatic experiences. These traditions developed elaborate authentication procedures to distinguish genuine divine communication from human fabrication. The systematization of religious law created new forms of divine authority, operating through textual rather than personal revelation. Extensive legal and ritual codes represented attempts to preserve divine will in written form, creating permanent records that could guide human behavior without requiring ongoing divine communication. These legal traditions established precedents for text-based religious authority that would become fundamental to later Abrahamic traditions. Economic systems underwent radical restructuring as temple-controlled resources were redistributed. Massive agricultural estates were converted to royal domains or distributed among emerging merchant classes. Trade relationships expanded dramatically as Mesopotamian merchants sought new markets to replace the economic functions previously performed by divine institutions. The development of standardized weights, measures, and currency systems reflects the need for human institutions to perform economic coordination that had previously operated through supernatural means. Educational systems transformed as temple schools previously focused on training priests to communicate with divine beings were converted to secular institutions, emphasizing practical skills, mathematical calculation, and textual interpretation. The development of historical consciousness during this period represents a fundamental shift in how Mesopotamian cultures understood their relationship to time and change. Moving from a world governed by eternal divine principles that never changed to a world shaped by human decisions, human failures, and human achievements. Medical practices underwent significant transformation as healing traditions that had relied on divine intervention were replaced by systematic observation and empirical treatment methods. Medical texts from the post-departure period show increased emphasis on natural remedies, surgical procedures, and diagnostic techniques operating through human knowledge. The development of professional medical training programs reflects the need to systematize healing knowledge previously transmitted through divine inspiration. And through all of these changes, the new laws, the new temples, the new ways of reading the sky and the liver, and the behavior of oil on water, a single thread runs consistently. Human beings adapting, creating, preserving, taking what had been given and building something new from it. The divine departure did not end civilization. It transformed it, completely and permanently, into something that we might begin to recognize as our own. The transformation of ancient Mesopotamian civilization following the divine departure has created ripple effects that continue to influence contemporary understanding of human origins and our relationship with the cosmos. Modern archaeological discoveries, combined with advances in genetic analysis, astronomical modeling, and material science, have provided new perspectives on the ancient accounts while raising profound questions about the nature of early human civilization and its possible connections to intelligences beyond our own. The paleo-contact hypothesis, developed by researchers who have examined ancient Mesopotamian texts alongside archaeological anomalies, suggests that the Anunnaki described in Sumerian sources were not mythological deities, but representatives of an advanced extraterrestrial civilization that established temporary presence on Earth during humanity's early developmental period. The systematic nature of their departure, as documented across archaeological and textual evidence, would represent the conclusion of a planned intervention rather than the fading of mythological imagination. Contemporary analysis of Mesopotamian metallurgical achievements provides compelling support for such interpretations. The precision manufacturing evident in ceremonial objects from major temple sites demonstrates technological capabilities that exceed reconstructed ancient techniques by margins that conventional archaeology finds difficult to explain. Modern attempts to replicate these artifacts using period-appropriate tools and methods have consistently failed to achieve the material properties and dimensional accuracy observed in original specimens. The incorporation of rare earth elements in ancient bronze alloys, the microscopic precision of golden ceremonial implements, the sophisticated crystal matrices found in temple foundations, all suggest access to knowledge and technology that conventional historical models cannot adequately account for. Genetic studies of ancient Mesopotamian populations have revealed anomalous characteristics that align with hypotheses about hybrid populations. DNA. Analysis of skeletal remains from high-ranking religious personnel shows genetic markers deviating significantly from baseline human populations. These anomalies appear most frequently in family lineages associated with direct divine communication, suggesting hereditary transmission of traits that may have resulted from genetic manipulation or hybridization programs. Modern astronomical analysis has provided new insights into the celestial phenomena recorded during the period of divine departure. Computer modeling of ancient sky configurations confirms the accuracy of Mesopotamian planetary position records, lending credibility to the more unusual astronomical claims embedded in the same archives. The atmospheric disturbances recorded in ice core samples during the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era provide additional evidence of global phenomena that coincide with Mesopotamian accounts. Elevated concentrations of metallic particles and electromagnetic anomalies suggesting large-scale technological activity of planetary significance. Recurring themes in world mythologies describing the departure of gods demonstrate remarkable consistency across cultures that had no known contact with each other. Norse mythology's Ragnarok describes the final departure of divine beings from active earthly involvement. Mesoamerican traditions preserve accounts of feathered serpent deities ascending to celestial realms with promises to return. Hindu scriptures describe the departure of divine avatars at the end of cosmic cycles. Native American traditions contain detailed accounts of star beings returning to their celestial homes after completing their earthly missions. The specific details preserved across these isolated traditions, flying vehicles, advanced technology, promises of eventual return, create patterns that extend far beyond mythological coincidence. Somewhere in the long night between their departure and our present moment, the memory of what occurred was transformed, slowly, generation by generation, from history into myth, from record into story, from fact into symbol. The clay tablets crumbled. The temples were buried under sand. The names of the astronomer priests who had watched the firestar move across the sky were forgotten. But the stories persisted. They changed shape, took on new forms, wore the costumes of different cultures and different languages. Yet beneath all of that transformation, certain details remained remarkably consistent. The sky vehicles, the luminous beings, the careful departure, the promise to return. Modern psychological research into religious experience and altered states of consciousness has provided new frameworks for understanding ancient accounts of divine communication. Studies of neuroplasticity and electromagnetic field effects on brain function suggest that the advanced technologies possessed by ancient divine beings may have included sophisticated methods for directly influencing human consciousness. The systematic failure of traditional divination methods following divine departure might represent the cessation of technological enhancement of human psychic capabilities, rather than purely spiritual abandonment. The ongoing mystery of divine departure continues to influence human understanding of our origins, our relationship to the cosmos, and our potential future development. Whether interpreted through religious, scientific, or alternative archaeological frameworks, the ancient accounts of divine withdrawal represent a pivotal moment in human history, a moment that established the conditions for independent human civilization, while preserving, in the words of temple inscriptions and in the arrangements of abandoned sacred spaces, the possibility of renewed contact. The careful protocols followed by departing divine beings, their systematic closure of earthly installations, their orderly transfer of knowledge and authority, their promises of eventual return, suggest sophisticated ethical frameworks governing intervention in developing civilizations. As humanity approaches technological capabilities that may soon allow us to influence other worlds in development, the ancient accounts of divine departure offer something rare and valuable. The perspective of those who came before us, who faced similar choices, and who departed thoughtfully rather than carelessly. The mystery remains open. It awaits resolution through continued archaeological discovery, advancing scientific analysis, and perhaps, one quiet day, direct contact with the advanced intelligences who may have shaped our earliest civilizations before departing into the cosmic night, leaving behind only traces of their presence in stone and clay, and the long memories of priests who stood in empty temples at dawn and wrote down everything they had witnessed. And perhaps that is the most human thing of all, to stand in an empty room where something extraordinary once dwelled, and to refuse to let the memory of it die, to press it into clay, to carve it into stone, to tell it generation after generation in the darkness before sleep, so that somewhere across all the vast distances of time, it might still be heard by whoever needs to hear it. The tablets have been read, the fires have been remembered. The stars that the ancient watchers named are still there, overhead, unchanged by the passing of all these thousands of years. And somewhere in the deep quiet of the night, in the space between one breath and the next, perhaps something of that original silence, the silence that fell over the temples when the eternal flames went out, can still be felt. A vast, ancient, and strangely peaceful stillness stretching back through all of human time. Let that stillness settle over you now, gently and completely. Let the story rest. Let the ancient world return to its long sleep beneath the earth, and let your own thoughts slow and soften and grow dim, like stars fading at the edge of morning. You have traveled far tonight. You have walked through the temples of Nippur and Eridu and Uruk, alongside the priests who tended eternal flames and watched the stars with care and reverence. You have heard the silence that fell when the divine voices ceased, and you have witnessed the extraordinary human effort to preserve, adapt, and continue in the aftermath of that silence. It is a story about loss, yes, But it is also a story about resilience, about creativity, about the remarkable persistence of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. Now it is time to rest. Let all of that spaciousness hold you gently as you drift towards sleep. The world is ancient and full of wonder. The stars above you tonight are the same stars that Nabu Ramani watched from his ziggurat stairway in the Babylonian night. The silence around you is made of the same material as the silence that settled over the temple of Enlil on the morning when Ur-Namche arrived for his purification ritual and found the chamber changed. Everything that has ever been quiet is somehow present in the quiet of this moment. You are safe. You are warm. You are held in the long, patient embrace of all of human history, which has always, in every age and every culture, told stories in the darkness to help the sleeping mind find its way home. There is nothing you need to do or understand tonight. Simply rest. Simply breathe. Simply allow the ancient world to carry you softly forward into sleep, the way those long ago priests must have hoped the gods would carry them, gently, carefully, towards somewhere luminous and far. Good night, and sleep well.